August 16, 1777. The morning air in Vermont is heavy with summer heat, the kind that makes wool uniforms cling and tempers run short. From a hilltop vantage point, a German officer stands with his spyglass in hand, calmly surveying the ground below. What he sees only confirms his expectations. Lines of American militia slowly advancing, men in rough homespun clothes, armed with mismatched muskets and rifles. They look nothing like professional soldiers. They are farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, and boys barely grown into manhood. To the officer's trained eye, they are nothing more than a disorderly mob. He allows himself a smile, confident that his disciplined Hessians, men who had drilled for years on European parade grounds, will scatter these amateurs with ease. What the officer cannot see through his glass, however, is the determination burning in those men below. They are not marching for pay or prestige, but for their homes, families, and the fragile idea of independence that still trembles on the edge of collapse. Less than 2 years earlier, the Declaration of Independence had been signed, but the dream it promised was faltering. George Washington's army had endured humiliating defeats in 1776, chased from New York and nearly destroyed in New Jersey. A bold strike at Trenton and Princeton gave hope, but by the summer of 1777, the revolution was still hanging by a thread. For the British, this was the moment to crush the rebellion once and for all. London had devised a grand strategy: cut the colonies in half by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. If New England, the beating heart of rebellion, could be isolated from the middle and southern colonies, resistance might collapse. 3 British forces were to converge on Albany, General Howe marching north from New York City, Barry St. Ledger pushing east through the Mohawk Valley, and General John Burgoyne advancing south from Canada. Burgoyne's column, reinforced by thousands of Hessian auxiliaries, native allies, and artillery, formed the main thrust. To men like the officer on that hilltop, victory seemed not only likely but inevitable. Yet strategy drawn on maps in London rarely survives contact with the American wilderness. Dense forests, broken roads, swollen rivers, and hostile locals made Burgoyne's advance agonizingly slow. Supplies dwindled, horses starved, and wagons broke. To solve this problem, Burgoyne had dispatched this very officer, Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, with orders to seize a supply depot at Bennington. It was meant to be a quick raid, 3 or 4 days at most, but on this hilltop, Baum's complacency would prove fatal. He believed he was facing nothing but a rabble of farmers. In truth, he was about to collide with men who would change the war. In 1777, the American Revolution was teetering on the brink of collapse. The year before had brought crushing defeats for the Continental Army. New York lost, soldiers retreating across New Jersey, morale collapsed. Though Washington's surprise victories at Trenton and Princeton bought the cause precious time, the British still believed the rebellion could be ended swiftly with the right stroke of strategy. In London, that strategy was drawn up by Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the colonies. It was simple, elegant, and devastating in concept: cut the colonies in half. The British understood that New England was the hotbed of radicalism, the spark that had ignited rebellion. If they could sever it from the middle and southern colonies by controlling the Hudson River Valley, the rest of the rebellion might wither. 3 armies were set in motion to execute this plan. General William Howe was to march north from New York City. Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger would push east through the Mohawk Valley. And the centerpiece, General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny to his troops, would drive south from Canada along the Lake Champlain-Hudson corridor with an army of more than 7,000. Their rendezvous point was Albany. Once there, they would command the entire Hudson River and strangle New England into isolation. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it carried fatal weaknesses. Burgoyne's force was formidable. British redcoats seasoned in empire, Hessian mercenaries with reputations for iron discipline, native allies skilled in frontier warfare, Canadian auxiliaries, and a train of 42 cannons. Yet armies, no matter how professional, run on food, fodder, and supplies. Every step south stretched Burgoyne's lifeline thinner. In the American wilderness, where roads were little more than muddy tracks and bridges scarce, wagons broke, horses died, and rations dwindled. For every mile gained, his supply line back to Canada grew longer and more vulnerable. By late summer, the cracks were widening. Horses were starving for lack of fodder, soldiers were reduced to half rations, and native allies, promised quick victories, were drifting away. Burgoyne knew he could not push on without replenishment. His maps and intelligence suggested a perfect solution. Bennington, a modest Vermont settlement rumored to hold stores of food, ammunition, horses, and wagons. Better still, reports claimed the countryside was thick with loyalists eager to rise for the king. If Burgoyne could seize those supplies, his campaign might yet surge forward. So he chose to gamble. A detachment under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum was ordered east with 800 men to raid Bennington. To Burgoyne, it seemed a small, necessary errand. But hidden within this decision were the seeds of disaster. The fate of his grand strategy, and indeed of Britain's hopes in America, would soon hinge on that raid. On August 11, 1777, Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum set out from Fort Miller on the Hudson River with roughly 800 men. His mission seemed straightforward. March 30 miles east, seize the supplies at Bennington, and return quickly to Burgoyne's main army. Burgoyne's orders were clear: speed was essential, avoid unnecessary fighting, secure the wagons and food, and return before the Americans could react. But from the very beginning, Baum's expedition stumbled into the harsh reality of the northern frontier. The roads were little more than forest trails, muddy after summer rains and choked with fallen trees. Wagons broke their axles on rocks, horses strained against deep ruts, and progress slowed to a crawl, 10 miles a day at best. The men, sweating under heavy wool coats and brass helmets, found the august heat suffocating. This was no rapid strike, but a grinding trudge through hostile country. And hostile it was. Militia scouts shadowed the column, firing shots from the tree line before melting away. Locals drove off livestock, burned stores, and cut down bridges to slow the Hessians. Every farmstead Baum passed was empty of supplies. Every mile, more evidence that the loyalist support Burgoyne had promised was a mirage. Instead of friendly subjects, Baum found a countryside alive with enemies. As Baum struggled forward, the Americans were already mobilizing. Word of his march raced across New England, carried by riders who spread alarm from village to village. Drums beat in town squares, church bells rang, and men grabbed muskets from over mantles. Militia units from Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire began to converge on Bennington. At the heart of this mobilization stood John Stark. A veteran of the French and Indian War, Stark had earned renown at Bunker Hill, where his men inflicted devastating losses on the advancing British. Yet earlier in 1777, his pride had been wounded, passed over for promotion by the Continental Congress in favor of younger officers. Stark resigned in anger. He returned home bitter, determined to leave the war behind. But when New Hampshire called on him to defend its people against Burgoyne's raiders, Stark agreed on one uncompromising condition. He would take orders only from New Hampshire, not from Congress or Continental generals. The state accepted, and Stark was given command of nearly 1,500 men, independent, fiercely loyal to him alone. By August 13th, Stark's militia had linked up with Vermont fighters under Seth Warner and Samuel Herrick, swelling the force to around 2,000. These were not uniformed regulars, but farmers and woodsmen who knew the terrain and carried their own rifles. Stark, moving with energy and purpose, chose not to sit behind defenses at Bennington. Instead, he would march out to meet Baum head-on. In the backwoods of Vermont, a collision was coming, one that would shatter Burgoyne's illusions of easy victory. By August 14th, Baum's column had reached high ground near a small river crossing called the Walloomsac, only a few miles from Bennington. His progress had been painfully slow, and now his scouts reported something troubling. The Americans were not a handful of militia guards as expected, but thousands of armed men gathering nearby. The loyalist uprising he had been promised was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the countryside seethed with hostility. Recognizing the danger, Baum chose caution. Rather than push forward blindly, he fortified his position. His men felled trees and built breastworks, arranging logs and earth into a defensive redoubt on a hilltop. 2 light cannons were positioned to cover the main approaches, while detachments of Hessians, Canadians, and native allies spread out to surrounding ridges to guard the flanks. On paper, it was a textbook defense, mutually supporting positions, commanding high ground, and artillery ready to tear through any frontal attack. Yet it carried a critical weakness. His already small force was divided into several isolated pockets that could not easily support one another. Then came the fatal mistake. Throughout the 14th and into the 15th, groups of men in civilian clothes approached Baum's camp. They carried muskets, wore broad-brimmed hats, and claimed to be loyalists eager to join the king's cause now that British troops were near. To Baum, this seemed like confirmation of his intelligence reports. He welcomed them, even assigning some to duties near his lines. But Baum spoke no English, relying entirely on translators and assumptions. He had no way of knowing that these supposed loyalists were in fact American scouts deliberately sent by John Stark to infiltrate his defenses. These allies walked freely among his men, noting cannon placements, counting troops and marking weaknesses. When they slipped away, they carried with them a detailed map of Baum's strength and dispositions. It was an intelligence coup, handed to Stark without a shot fired. On August 15th, heavy rain lashed the countryside, forcing both sides into temporary stillness. While his men shivered under soaked blankets, Stark studied the intelligence reports and saw his opportunity. Baum's divided positions could be attacked and overwhelmed if struck simultaneously. Rather than a frontal charge into Hessian cannons, Stark devised a bold, complex maneuver, a four-pronged envelopment. One column would circle north, another would sweep wide around to the west and south, a third would advance head-on to pin the enemy in place, and a fourth would strike at the bridge to cut off retreat. It was a plan that demanded precise timing and coordination, difficult even for trained regulars. Yet Stark believed his militia, many of them veterans of frontier fighting, could pull it off. As the storm clouds cleared, Baum believed he had secured his position. In truth, the Americans had already surrounded him, and the trap was nearly ready to spring. The morning of August 16, 1777 dawned hot and heavy. The fields around Bennington still slick with the previous day's storm. Mist clung to the valleys, muffling the sounds of men preparing for battle. John Stark moved among his troops, farmers, craftsmen, fathers and sons, checking muskets, urging calm, reminding them to keep their powder dry. Many had no uniforms, some carried old hunting rifles instead of standard muskets, but all carried a determination that professional soldiers often lacked. They were defending their own homes, their own families. Before the men marched out, Stark gathered them and pointed toward the Hessian positions in the distance. His words would echo through history. "There are your enemies, the Redcoats and the Tories. They are ours. Or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow." The name of his wife, known to all the New Hampshire men, gave the moment a weight beyond rhetoric. Stark was not offering escape or retreat, only victory or death. The men roared their approval, the cheer carrying across the valley like thunder. At around 3 in the afternoon, the American columns moved. 2 slipped quietly through the woods, circling wide to strike Baum's flanks and rear. Another advanced directly toward the fortified hill, deliberately showing themselves to draw the Hessians' attention. A final column prepared to seize the bridge, sealing off any hope of retreat. From his hilltop redoubt, Baum watched the militia approach. At first he dismissed them, ragged farmers, just as expected. His cannons and disciplined troops would scatter them easily. But as more Americans emerged from the trees, on the left, on the right behind, alarm began to spread. These were not isolated bands, but coordinated attacks from every direction. The battle erupted in a crackle of musket fire, smoke rolling across the hills. The Hessian cannons thundered, blasting canisters shot into advancing militia, tearing gaps in their lines. Yet the Americans kept moving, firing from behind trees and rocks, pressing forward in small groups rather than neat ranks. The Hessians, drilled to fight set-piece European battles, found themselves surrounded by an enemy they could not pin down. Baum's position fractured. Native allies and Canadian auxiliaries melted into the woods, unwilling to be trapped. Loyalist rangers vanished just as quickly, unwilling to die for the king's cause. Soon only the Hessians and a handful of British regulars held the redoubt. They fought fiercely, maintaining discipline under withering fire, but the pressure was relentless. After 2 brutal hours, Baum himself fell, struck by a musket ball to the abdomen. His men, low on ammunition and cut to pieces, attempted one desperate bayonet charge. For a moment, their gleaming blades pushed the militia back. But fresh volleys cut into their ranks, and Stark unleashed reserves to smash them from the flanks. The Hessian line shattered. Survivors threw down their arms and begged for quarter. By late afternoon, Baum's force was annihilated. Nearly 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans had lost only a few dozen. Against all expectation, farmers and shopkeepers had destroyed professional soldiers on open ground. But the day's trial was not yet over. Reinforcements were on their way. As Baum's shattered command collapsed, the thunder of musket fire faded into the hot August evening. Stark's men, exhausted but triumphant, began collecting prisoners and plundering the captured Hessian camp. Many were low on ammunition, others were tending to wounded comrades. The battlefield, littered with broken weapons and fallen men, was in chaos. That was the moment when danger struck again. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, a fresh column of German troops under Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Bremen marched into view. 600 strong, these were not weary stragglers, but elite grenadiers and light infantry, hand-picked soldiers of the Brunswick Corps. They had marched all day in suffocating heat, dragging 2 cannons with them, arriving late because of the miserable roads. Unaware that Baum's force had been destroyed, they advanced in perfect order, drums beating, banners flying, their formation as precise as on a European parade ground. For the battered Americans, the sight was terrifying. They had just spent hours storming Hessian redoubts. Many had fired their last cartridges, and now an organized, rested enemy line was bearing down on them. Von Bremen wasted no time. His men deployed from column into battle line with practiced efficiency, the cannons unlimbered and booming into the American positions. Stark's militia, scattered and tired, began to give ground. For a moment, panic threatened to undo the victory they had just won, but Stark refused to yield. He galloped along the lines, rallying his men, shouting encouragement, dragging companies back into formation. Even as ammunition ran low, the Americans fought stubbornly, using captured Hessian muskets and scavenged cartridges. They clung to cover, firing from trees and stone walls, slowing the German advance yard by yard. Yet it was clear they could not hold for long. Then salvation came. Colonel Seth Warner, commanding a detachment of 350 Green Mountain Boys and Massachusetts militia, had been marching hard toward the sound of gunfire all afternoon. As dusk approached, his men arrived on the field fresh and fully supplied with ammunition. Warner instantly sized up the crisis. Stark's men were faltering, and von Bremen's grenadiers were pressing hard. Without waiting for elaborate coordination, Warner wheeled his men into line and struck the German flank with sudden fury. The impact was devastating. Von Bremen's disciplined front, already stretched thin against Stark's ragged but determined defenders, now faced volleys and bayonet charges from an entirely new direction. Smoke thickened, musket fire roared, and the battlefield dissolved into brutal close combat. Bayonets, musket butts, and knives flashing in the gathering dusk. Outnumbered nearly 3-1 and exhausted from their march, the German line began to crumble. As darkness fell, von Bremen ordered a retreat. The Americans, bloodied but exultant, held the field once again. 6 cannons, hundreds of prisoners, and a second defeated enemy force lay as proof. The militia had not only won once that day, but twice. When the guns finally fell silent on the evening of August 16th, 1777, the hills around the Walloomsac River were strewn with the wreckage of 2 battles. Stark's men had fought from afternoon into twilight, first crushing Baum's Hessians, then breaking von Bremen's elite grenadiers. The cost to the Americans was real, about 70 killed and wounded, but compared to their enemies' losses, it was almost miraculous. Nearly 1,000 Germans, British loyalists, and auxiliaries lay dead, wounded, or captured. 6 cannons, wagons of ammunition, and hundreds of muskets were seized. For Burgoyne, the defeat was catastrophic. The men he had entrusted to secure supplies were gone. Instead of returning with food, wagons, and horses, Baum's expedition had been annihilated, and von Bremen's best soldiers had been driven from the field. Burgoyne's army, already staggering under hunger and exhaustion, now faced an impossible situation. His supply lines back to Canada were stretched to the breaking point, and reinforcements from General How would never arrive. Worse still, the psychological blow reverberated through his ranks. Native allies, once eager to fight alongside the British, began slipping away. They had joined what they thought would be a victorious campaign. Bennington convinced them otherwise. Without them, Burgoyne lost his eyes and ears in the wilderness. In the American camps, the mood was transformed. The militia, so often dismissed as unreliable and prone to panic, had not only stood their ground, but delivered a stunning victory against Europe's finest. Farmers, hunters, and craftsmen had captured professional soldiers by the hundreds. The myth of British and Hessian invincibility was shattered. Word spread swiftly across New England. Bells rang in town squares, crowds cheered in the streets, and enlistments surged. Men who had hesitated before now rushed to join the fight. And for the first time in months, confidence returned to the Patriot Corps. John Stark, the man who had resigned in bitterness only months earlier, became an instant hero. His aggressive tactics, his refusal to wait passively for the enemy, and his unwavering faith in his militia had been vindicated. Congress, which had once overlooked him, now showered him with praise. New Hampshire declared him their ranking general, and even Washington and Gates acknowledged his brilliance. Yet Stark himself, in his blunt frontier manner, credited the victory to his men. They had fought with courage born not of training but of necessity, defending their homes and liberty. For Burgoyne, the defeat at Bennington was far more than a setback. It crippled his campaign, drained his strength, and emboldened his enemies. The road south toward Albany, once so promising, was now lined with obstacles, both physical and psychological. The tide of the war had begun to shift, and the victory of ordinary militia at Bennington was the spark that set it in motion. The defeat at Bennington was more than the loss of a raiding party. It was a fracture line running straight through Burgoyne's grand campaign. His invasion depended on speed, confidence, and a steady flow of supplies. Bennington robbed him of all three. Instead of securing food, horses, and wagons, he had lost 1,500 irreplaceable men. Instead of rallying loyalists, the battle convinced many that siding with the British was a hopeless gamble. Instead of pressing forward with vigor, Burgoyne now found his army starved, demoralized, and shrinking by the day. The immediate consequences were brutal. His supply situation, already tenuous, became desperate. Horses, vital for dragging artillery and wagons, died of hunger and exhaustion. Soldiers were placed on half rations. The native warriors who had once scouted ahead vanished into the forests, unwilling to follow a general who could not win. Even the Canadian auxiliaries, never deeply committed, drifted away. Burgoyne's army was reduced not only in numbers but in spirit. Yet retreat was unthinkable for a British commander of his stature. To turn back would mean disgrace, the collapse of the campaign, perhaps even a court-martial in London. So Burgoyne chose to press on. Slowly, painfully, his weakened column pushed south toward Albany. Every mile was a struggle. American militia cut down trees to block roads, burned bridges, drove away livestock, and harassed supply wagons. What might have been a steady advance turned into a crawl through a hostile wilderness, with hunger gnawing at the men's bellies and fear growing in their minds. Meanwhile, the Americans drew strength from Bennington. Volunteers poured into General Horatio Gates's camp, swelling his army and boosting confidence. Men who had seen farmers and shopkeepers crush Hessians believed they too could stand against Burgoyne. For once, militia and continental troops stood side by side with equal pride. The balance of power was shifting, not just in numbers but in belief. By September, Burgoyne reached the outskirts of Saratoga. There, on the rolling fields and ridges, his battered army would face a reinforced and determined American force. At Freeman's Farm on September 19th and Bemmer's Heights on October 7th, the Americans fought with relentless energy. Daniel Morgan's riflemen picked off officers and artillery crews. Benedict Arnold, still a hero at this point, led charges that shattered British lines. The Americans fought with the confidence that Bennington had given them, proof that disciplined European troops could be beaten. On October 17th, 1777, the inevitable happened. Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men. It was the first time a British field army had laid down arms to colonial rebels. That surrender became the turning point of the Revolution, and it traced directly back to a muddy battlefield near Bennington, where militia proved their mettle. When Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga in October 1777, the shockwaves travelled far beyond the Hudson Valley. In London, the news landed like a thunderclap. Never before had a full British army laid down its arms to colonial rebels. Confidence in a swift victory evaporated. Parliament faced a sobering reality. The rebellion was not a passing insurrection, but a full-fledged war they might not win. But it was in Paris where the outcome truly changed the world. For more than a year, France had watched the conflict with cautious interest. The French monarchy under King Louis XVI longed for revenge against Britain, still smarting from losses in the 7 Years' War. Yet France was hesitant to commit openly. Supporting a rebellion that seemed destined to fail was too great a risk. Secret aid had trickled in, money, muskets and powders smuggled to the colonies. But a formal alliance required proof that the Americans could stand against Britain's professional armies. Saratoga, made possible by the victory at Bennington, provided exactly that proof. The surrender of Burgoyne's army demonstrated that the Americans were not a rabble of farmers destined for defeat, but a fighting force capable of winning on equal terms. It showed that Britain could be beaten in North America, and if Britain could be beaten there, then France could tilt the balance by entering the war. In February 1778, France signed the Treaty of Alliance with the United States. It was a sweeping commitment. France would fight alongside the Americans until independence was secured. French money began pouring into American coffers. Shipments of muskets, uniforms, cannons, and powder arrived by the ton. French warships challenged Britain's dominance at sea, and French soldiers prepared to cross the Atlantic. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was now part of a global conflict. The alliance transformed everything. Britain, once able to concentrate its strength on the American colonies, was suddenly forced to defend possessions in the Caribbean, India, and the Mediterranean. Spain and the Dutch Republic would soon join the fray, widening the war still further. For the Americans, French support meant survival. Without it, the revolution might have sputtered out under British pressure. With it, victory became possible. And at the root of it all was Bennington. Without the militia victory that crippled Burgoyne, there would have been no Saratoga. Without Saratoga, there would have been no French alliance. And without France, there might have been no United States. What began as a skirmish in the Vermont hills had become the spark that set the globe ablaze. The Battle of Bennington was not the largest clash of the American Revolution, nor the bloodiest, but its impact far outweighed its scale. On that August day in 1777, ordinary farmers and townsmen had stood against disciplined European troops and won. Their victory crippled Burgoyne's campaign, set the stage for Saratoga, and triggered the French alliance that transformed the revolution into a world war. In a very real sense, the fate of the United States was shaped on those wooded hills by men who had never seen a parade ground in their lives. For John Stark, the victory sealed his place in history. A man once overlooked and slighted by Congress now stood as one of the Revolution's great militia leaders. Stark returned to New Hampshire a hero, his reputation forever linked to the triumph at Bennington. Years later, in his old age, he would write a toast to his comrades who had fought that day. It contained the words that would outlive even his battlefield glory: "Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils." That simple phrase became the motto of New Hampshire and one of the enduring expressions of the American spirit. The battle also left a lesson about the nature of warfare in America. Professional armies, drilled to fight in rigid formations, found themselves vulnerable against a determined militia fighting on home ground. Stark's men did not march like redcoats, but they knew their forests and hills. They could move swiftly and strike suddenly, and they fought with the desperation of men defending their families. At Bennington, that spirit proved stronger than Hessian discipline or British steel. The memory of the victory spread quickly. In taverns, churches, and farmhouses across New England, men spoke with pride of how their neighbors had humbled the king's troops. The tale became a rallying cry, convincing thousands more to take up arms. Even long after the war ended, Bennington was remembered not just as a battle, but as a moment when the common people proved that they too could shape the destiny of nations. Today, the site of the battle is marked by the Bennington Battle Monument, a towering stone obelisk that rises above the Vermont landscape. It stands as a reminder of the day when ordinary citizens, led by a man determined never to bow to authority unjustly, struck a blow that echoed across the world. A German officer who had once looked through his spyglass saw only farmers and shopkeepers. What he could not see was the fire in their hearts, the will to fight for freedom. That fatal miscalculation cost him his command and helped give birth to a nation.